After talking about so many characters in FF14, I am rather excited to finally getting around to talking about my favorite one. And indeed, I am sure he is really high up there for anyone watching as well. Due to the sheer amount of screen time dedicated to his story, this video will probably be the longest character analysis video I have made thus far. So I feel it's appropriate to start off with the bottom line. Alphinaud is the secondary protagonist of the Hydaelyn/Zodiac story arc. Or, to phrase it more accurately, he's the Deuteragonist of the story. For those not familiar with literature jargon, to put it simply, a Deuteragonist refers to the second most important character behind the protagonist. In other words, I believe that if the developers didn't choose to have an avatar represent the main character, aka the Warrior of Light, that Alphinaud would have most likely been the protagonist of this entire story. I will return to this subject later on into the video. Another notable thing about Alphinaud is something I alluded to just now, the fact that he has the most screen time dedicated to him out of any character in this whole story, screen time that was used wisely and gave him one of the most memorable character arcs ever. Alphinaud is a character that went from this to this.
What you need is a mirror, not a painting. It will capture the horror I see before me far better than I ever could.
To this.
Is that what you think?
In my misbegotten youth. But what I believed wisdom was no more than aggressive ignorance. I've since learned to look beyond the banners and the politics. To see people as individuals with their own hopes and dreams.
The topic of today's video then is to discuss this journey in its entirety, and it will feature both analysis and lore as I walk you through the key moments of Alphinaud's story, stopping to explain them as I see fit. I wanted to wait until Endwalker had come out to talk about him, and oh boy am I glad that I did. You know, I think I cried like 4 or 5 times in scenes with the twins alone in Endwalker. It was one hell of a journey. I also want to make a little disclaimer. I will be making a video about both Alphinaud and Alysay separately, and because there's quite a bit of overlap in their stories, mainly their backstory as well as their relation to each other, the way I've decided to split these is that in this one, with Alphinaud, I will go over their backstory at large. Then, in Alysay's video, I will talk about the relationship of the twins. I will also most likely focus more on Fourchenault in this video and Améliance in Alysay's video, because I think that's fitting as well. And obviously I will cover the Bahamut story in Alysay's video as well. Just so you know that I am not ignoring these aspects, I just wanna keep both videos fresh and not copy-paste and make sure that there's enough things to talk about in both. Compared to the other characters from the main cast in Endwalker, we are privy to a surprising amount of knowledge on both Alphinaud's and Alysay's childhoods as told throughout the entirety of FF14. It would therefore be remiss of me to not delve deeper into the childhood of Alphinaud in this video, and this segment will be me doing just that, talking about where he was at prior to our introduction to him in that card/boat ride in A Realm Reborn, as exploring his upbringing is important in order to understand what led to his downfall and the subsequent redemption that followed. A long time ago, following the great floods of the 6th Umbral Calamity, a man by the name of Nunkrep Nunkrefsson created a massive ark, aptly named Nunkrep's Hope, saving many from meeting a terrifying end via drowning in the process. There were some complications that ended up with that particular ark beached on top of a mountain in Gur Abania, but he made a new ship and sailed to an island to the northwest, helping to form what would eventually become the nation of Sharlayan. Alphinaud's ancestors were among those who boarded that original ark, a fact which would make the Levelier name in Charlian more and more prestigious and renowned over time, as fewer and fewer houses were able to claim to have their origins rooted that far back in the nation's history. Indeed, the Levelier house took full advantage of being the OGs to the point that they even took Nunkrep's grand pronouncement as their official family creed, renounce the ways of war, and pursue enlightenment through knowledge and reason. It shouldn't come as a surprise then that the Levelier name would go on to age like fine wine, garnering more and more respect as the centuries went by, each generation living up to the words of Nunkrep. In the story, we know of 3 of the most recent of these generations. From the oldest of these generations, only Louisua Levelier is known. He was parent to Fourchenault. Fourchenault then married Ameliance, who took up the Levelier name as well. Their offspring came in the form of twins, Alphinaud and Analysing. Louisua was a legendary Archon, standing toe-to-toe with the likes of Archons Matoya and Galuf. A huge turning point in relations in this family came when Louisua advocated to help Eorzeans from their impending doom, something that he came to predict due to his expertise and wisdom of ancient prophecies, as well as his study into fallen civilizations of eras past. Remember that family motto I mentioned? Well, Louisua had his own interpretation of things. He believed that Nunkrep's actions spoke larger than his words. To understand his line of reasoning better, let's consider the backdrop for what led to Nunkrep coming to that stance of renouncing war and all that. The Age of Enlightenment was a period during the 5th Astral Era during which civilizations were at their peak through people's expertise with the arcane, and this magical ingenuity birthed many great cultures. The architectural prowess by itself trounces anything that we see in modern-day Eorzea, something that is very clearly on display whenever we visit old Maki, Nym, or Amdapori locales. This period of prosperity then led to the War of the Magi, which then resulted in the 6th Umbral Calamity, where everything was flooded. We know this, but it's important in understanding that Nunkrep, being a presumably scholarly person, would have observed this period of greatness and had seen firsthand what the 3 or so centuries of rampant warfare had done to the realm, leading all these once great civilizations to total ruin. Given that he lived through this era, it makes perfect sense that he would incorporate this heavily anti-war rhetoric when creating the foundation for what would become Charlian. What most likely led to Louisua to think that his words have less merit than his actions was the fact that his pronouncement was a natural result of the landscape at the time and relies heavily on the context of that specific era. In other words, his words would have been outdated. His actions, on the other hand, spoke volumes regardless of the context. Louisua therefore asserted that choosing to save the great and the small from the rising tides was the true mark of their founder's virtue. Keep in mind that Louisua had extensively studied the downfall of many civilizations and thoroughly read into many prophecies. It's sensible that he would see the situation in this light, that in choosing to screw over your fellow neighbor, mankind would lead itself down the path of ruin. Unsurprisingly, this line of thinking was not received well by his peers. For those who were patriotic and for those who came to live their life under Nunkrep's doctrine, Louisua's sentiments were blasphemous, but more than that, it caused a divide within the Levelier family. We do not know Ameliance's stance on it or her relation to Louisua, but what we do know is that his son, Fourchenault, vehemently disagreed with Louisua's stand. He fervently believed in Nunkrep's doctrine, which made him at odds with Louisua. This was in spite of the fact that Fourchenault very much loved and admired his father in equal measure. He had trouble coming to terms with how a great man like his father would be at odds with the philosophy of his peers and even the very founder of their nation, a philosophy that his entire way of life revolved around. This would end up tormenting Fourchenault for a long time. The takeaway here is that Louisoix went against the norm with his line of thinking and wanted to help those in need, Charlian or no. Fourchenault, on the other hand, heavily believed in Charlian doctrine, particularly that of the Bibliothèque, the dominant faction in Charlian at the time, a doctrine which fostered a mindset of non-intervention. This led to internal strife within the Levelier family. This bashing of heads between father and son is important to bring up because it would eventually bleed into the next generation, meaning it would become a crucial point in both Alphinaud's and Analysing's characters. If you wish to know more about what happened to Louisoix after this point, I recommend checking out my Bahamut video, where I go more in detail regarding his journey into Eorzea, but in short, against his son's judgment, he decided to depart to Eorzea to help them out with the coming calamity. His assistance in helping bridge the relations between the grand companies in Eorzea, his invaluable knowledge on dealing with the primal threat, as well as his bold plan of summoning the 12 to prevent the 7th Umbral calamity, all helped to elevate his status both domestically and internationally, making Louisoix somewhat of a legend, even if only a select few individuals knew what truly happened to him at Cardinal. I would also like to mention here that just because Louisoix earned the status of the most Chad sage the world has ever known, Fourchenault himself was no slouch either. In fact, one could argue that due to the 30 or so year age difference between them, Fourchenault was about as well off as Louisoix, proportionally speaking. He had an abundance of intellect of his own and became a member of the Forum, Charlian's governing body, at a relatively young age. He was also among the select few that worked on Charlian's plan of the Great Exodus to the Moon, even calling many of the shots within that project, seeing as he became the architect of the project at some point. Though their work was secretive and thus unknown to the wide public, he was still known as a powerful member within the Forum. Therefore, we can pretty easily see how influential the Levelier name was, not just due to its rich and proud history, but also through the accomplishments of the last two older generations specifically, which plays into the story of the twins as well. Speaking of which, the birth of Alphinaud and Analysing came at an unfortunate time for Fourchenault. A few years before they were born, the Garleans invaded Alamigo, and their Dervanian colony was in serious jeopardy. Fourchenault attempted to parley a peace, but to no avail, and the Forum came to a decision to abandon the colony, to have everyone travel to the northern archipelago of the motherland in an exodus. This exodus was put in motion in the year of 1562 of the 6th Astral Era, when the twins were not even a year old. Though they have no recollection of this exodus, it could be said it was an unfortunate time to be born. But this was not the actual unfortunate event, but rather something that soon followed. Sometime afterward, Fourchenault joined the Secretive Moon Exodus project I had mentioned earlier. This demanded a lot of his attention, and his work became a much more major part of his life. Though the twins meant the world to him, it meant that he was slightly more distant during their childhoods. Not to the point of being a completely absentee father, but enough that Louisoix became as much of a father figure to them as Fourchenault himself, if not more so. This had a huge impact on the upbringing of the twins, as it meant that between the two conflicting mindsets within the family, it was Louisoix's ideologies that ended up becoming the prevalent one, and the one that the twins would largely inherit. Now, that is not to say that Louisoix did it with malicious intent. I don't think he meant to step on his son's toes or force the twins into a certain mindset. I think it's simply more of an organic type of growth, as Fourchenault was more absent, while Louisoix was there to be a supportive grandparent and help raise them. It is interesting that, if not for this fateful turn of events where Fourchenault became part of the Forum's secret project, the twins would have most likely grown up with an altogether different mindset, one much more aligned with their father. But as for the actual events that unfolded, they would be imparted with Louisoix's view of the world and his own knowledge for the most part. Though their time with their grandfather was relatively short, they came to admire and love him in great amounts, and indeed both of them would often find themselves quoting the words that Louisoix said to Fourchenault before his departure to Eorzea, among those words being, to ignore the plight of those, one might say if conceivably is not wisdom, it is indolence. Supposedly, he had said those words to Fourchenault verbatim many times, as their arguments became so common and monotone that it was akin to a rehearsal for a play. Now that we have the backdrop for Alphinaud's upbringing, we can talk about his actual childhood between the ages 11 and 16. Firstly, Alphinaud would go on to achieve a great feat by being accepted into the studium at age 11, something that was wholly unprecedented. Analysing would also enroll about half a year afterwards. The twins were proving to become great scholars, and this made Louisoix exceedingly proud of his grandchildren. Speaking of which, Louisoix had talked about leaving to Eorzea for a while, and the day was finally upon them. Alphinaud, Analysing, and Fourchenault were all there to see him off. This is chronologically the first time where we get to see the twins have a disagreement in a major way. Alphinaud sees the merit in Louisoix's choice and responds in a rather stoic way, while Analysing is really distraught by their grandfather actually leaving, and she has a problem with Alphinaud not saying anything in that situation. Some time passes and the twins get a letter from Urianger. In it, he details the events at Cardinal, something that the twins had only seen a very skewed image of through a telescope in the studium. In it, he describes how Bahamut arose from the artificial moon and turned the battlefields of Cardinal into a scene of hell on earth. The most shocking part came at the very end of his message, however. On the broken fields of Cardinal did my dearest mentor, thy beloved grandsire, become as light and embark upon his final journey. Alphinaud's shoulders trembled with quiet sorrow, while Analysing wailed aloud, caring not who heard her grief. Though it devastated both of them, Louisoix's supposed death nonetheless bolstered the views that their dear grandfather had departed onto the twins. From here until the start of the game, a few important things happen in Alphinaud's life, most of it being related to his time in school, with the exception of one particular event. One day, as the twins left their estate and were going down the stairs towards Oak's Landing, Analysing, in her hurry, tripped on the stairs and badly scraped her knee in the process. Alphinaud had only previously dabbled into magic, but never cast it on an actual person. In that situation, he nonetheless tried casting the one primitive restorative spell he had only just learned on Analysing. How she smiled when the wound closed, the joy and relief. In that moment, embraced by the warmth of brotherly love, Alphinaud made the choice to have the arts of healing be the main subject of his studies, something that would assist him immensely when he would go on to become a formidable healer later on in his life. But more importantly, it was most likely this event that led Alphinaud towards the path of wanting to be a big brother figure to his sister, Analysing. Incidentally, it was also near this very same place in a fountain where Analysing loved to play, where Alphinaud's ineptitude to swim would surface, or I guess not surface, as he sunk like a stone. I mentioned him being accepted into the studium at a very young age. What is the studium though? With a long and storied history, it is without question the world's leading authority in meteorology, the arcane, the occult, astromancy, and countless other fields, standing proud as Charlemagn's foremost educational institute. This description, at least, according to Alphinaud's enthusiastic ramblings that he would give to any new student. In layman's terms, it is this world's equivalent of a university, down to even requiring a thesis in order to graduate. Not only was Alphinaud the youngest student to ever enter, he also graduated with the highest honors in magical arts and meteorology, and he was the #1 undisputed debater, dropping bars on any unfortunate fool that came across him. He became so popular that he even had his own fan club in school. There were of course people who didn't approve of him, but they quickly learned that people who crossed Alphinaud would have his army of fanboys come after them. In short, this was a guy you didn't want to mess with unless you wanted to get bullied for the entire semester. And when you're stuck in a little island with only a single school in it, getting bullied day in day out isn't probably a good thing. Of course, it's not like Alphinaud orchestrated these fanboys going after his haters. It just happened automatically. In fact, Alphinaud largely ignored his fans, seeing them as below him. It was also in school where he got a taste of leadership, and indeed, he wouldn't really befriend anyone because he simply couldn't stand not being the one in charge. Both of these things stem from his intelligence, his prestigious background, and the feats of his grandfather, which all served to make him a rather arrogant person growing up. The idea of being a leader as something that is given for him, as well as viewing other students as people below him, will come into play in a big way later on in his life, and it was all set up during his childhood here. Of note is what Alphinaud chose to write his thesis about. It was a political paper about their motherland. More specifically, of Charleon's duty to protect all life on this star. Naturally, this was seen as controversial as it goes directly against Charleon's policy of non-intervention. Indeed, he would get into many debates over this topic, and if you remember how he became the undisputed best debater in the studium, yeah, that was mainly over this very topic, because Alphinaud was stubborn AF and would go on lengthy debates with everyone and their grandmother over this singular belief which he held fast to. This also didn't help his relationship with his father. By doing this, he had essentially reopened the same conflict that drove a wedge between father and son within the earlier generation. Not to mention the fact that Fourchenault was still a leading member of the forum. It would seem that history was to repeat itself, as the debate of intervention versus non-intervention once again caused turmoil within the Livelier family. At age 16, shortly after they had both graduated from the studium, the twins were old enough to be of age in Charleon, and so could basically do whatever they wanted independently. Together, they decided to leave for Eorzea because they shared their grandfather's beliefs and were curious to see what kind of a world was it that their grandfather gave his life to protect. Needless to say, Fourchenault did not approve of this decision, but seeing as they were old enough in Charleon to make their own choices, he didn't bar their path, and so the two set sail on to Eorzea with identical grimoires in hand. This concludes the backstory portion of Alphinaud's character, as was compiled by me through side stories as well as quests in Endwalker, Shadowbringers and other expansions. I normally don't delve this much into a character's backstory whenever I do an analysis on them, but I felt like making an exception here because you learn a lot about Alphinaud's childhood both in the lead up to Endwalker as well as in Endwalker proper. And when you go back and reapply those story bits, and by going through it in a chronological order from an in-universe timeline perspective, the dots connect really nicely. And connect those dots I will, some in just a moment, others in due time.
From this moment forth, I declare you crystal braves. Let us mend this fractured realm and face our enemies as one.
With this information in hand, we much better understand where he was at when we first met him right after the opening cinematic finished, after we first fired up the game, which for some of you may have been 8 years ago. Yeah, just let that sink in. That's how long ago players were first introduced to this character. Though some of you may have obviously not started playing all the way back in 2013 and instead joined somewhere along the way, or even maybe very recently, this is still an important factor because it's a big part of what makes Alphinaud such a memorable character, because it was a character that, by design, they wanted to have grow slowly over the many stories told. They spaced his character arc over a long term. They didn't try to rush it, they really took their time and ensured that his growth happened as organically as possible, and thus we came to really appreciate the struggles that he went through and what shaped him to be the person he is now. So to connect that backstory portion to present day, aka A Realm Reborn, he starts off as this highly irritable, arrogant, full of himself annoying brat who thinks he can change the world by riding off the back of his grandfather's accomplishments. Even at an early age, he shows aptitude to being in charge, and he rarely befriended boys of his age, purely because he couldn't stand not being the one who gets to call the shots, as I talked about earlier. He's someone who thinks of himself as an amazing leader, but he views the people working for him as basically his minions, giving little care or concern for them, such as when he would simply point the warrior flight at the enemy like they are a simple tool, a sword, that he can just fling around as he pleases to fix his problems. This all of course makes sense. He is the child to a very successful man domestically, and grandchild to an even more successful man both domestically and worldwide, someone who is pretty much a legend. He graduated when most kids of his age were still trying to figure out the alphabet, hyperbolically speaking. So yes, he followed a great legacy and had his own accomplishments to back it up. This really fed his own ego, because he saw much greatness in himself. After all, since he was so smart and had an amazing figure such as Eorzea to both look up to as well as live up to, he now adopted a similar philosophy as Eorzea, who had successfully saved Eorzea earlier, so of course he would do the same. And thanks to his own accomplishments, he would be in a perfect position to do so, right? Well, the problem is that these accomplishments did not really prepare him in any capacity to become a successful leader in Eorzea, as he lacked any hands-on experience. A huge oversight in his grand scheme, and this oversight would be a blunder that would prove to be a rather fatal mistake. So he and his sister traveled to Eorzea in the hopes that they could better understand why the hell their grandfather devoted so much for this foreign land, a question to which Alphinaud figures out the answer to relatively painlessly. In contrast to his sister, we are introduced to Alphinaud as someone who, in addition to the above things I mentioned, is a solid diplomat, as seen by his interactions with the Grand Company leaders. Although, to be fair, he do be riding on his grandfather's pedigree to get some credibility there. He's also rather astute, the best example of which I can give is when he's able to deduce that his grandfather had become the primal phoenix, but there are of course many points throughout the game that shows his intelligence. I will talk more about his positive character traits because he gains some more later, or shall I say they are brought more to the forefront, but that's the gist of it in A Realm Reborn. But his biggest character trait is that he's a dreamer. He's got these grand ideals, and he's very egotistical about it, thinking that he alone can bring these amazing concepts to fruition. The combination of naivety, big ego, and severe lack of experience make for a particularly nasty trifecta, as Alphinaud is about to find out. It is towards the end of A Realm Reborn, when his entire worldview comes crumbling down, when reality hits him, life hits him. Who the hell do you think you are, coming to this land that you never been to in your life, trying to guide these people who have dealt with this nonsense for ages, and thinking you got the solutions when you are just a little kid with next to no life experience? So yeah, that whole story arc with the Crystal Braves happens. Y'all know how it went down. He thought the city-state leaders were doing a mediocre job, said, "Hey, I can do it better," and started spam recruiting people without filter for his new little military gang. Naturally, some bad apples came through, and these people completely and utterly bamboozled him without even trying much, I might add, because it was piss easy, like taking candy from a baby, or a military force from a child, I guess is more fitting. This is all already bad enough, right? You thought yourself the smartest person you ever met, yet you got outplayed by a couple of sandblasted grease monkeys. Talk about humiliating. You lost everything you carefully worked towards your entire time here. It's all gone down the drain. This is pretty much the turning point for Alphinaud. He completely breaks down and loses all hope as he comes to realize how he treated people as pawns and touted this nonsense about the salvation of Eorzea, all for the sake of his own vanity. But even if it's the turning point, it's not the trigger that causes him to start changing. It is because of what follows that causes the gears in his head to slowly turn. Which is when people start dying either because of his blunders or by being around him. That is truly when it all starts to sink in for him. He thought he had the answers to everything, but in reality he knew nothing. He thought he knew how this works by reading about it in books, but it is now that he discovers what it means to lose people, what it means to deal with death. He discovers just how horrible war really is. And through these shocking life-changing experiences, he gets humbled and comes to realize how little he really knows and how sorely he lacks any real experience.
So, Master Alphinaud, are you content to remain a broken blade? Is there no flame hot enough to reforge you?
Now, in this situation, it would be really easy for most people to simply throw their hands in the air and say, "Oh well, I failed," and then either decide to give up or just try doing the same thing again. Alphinaud does neither of those things. He then observes. He observes characters like the Warrior of Light, Estinian, Uzael, and Emeric, and tries to understand and learn how these people operate, how he could do better, and how to apply these to leadership qualities. The Warrior of Light demonstrates great courage and bravery, as well as confidence, all things that are crucial for any leader to have. Estinian teaches him how he should respect people instead of seeing them as mere means to an end. Uzael serves as a reminder that compassion is still very much important, as well as being the one to encourage Alphinaud to utilize his exceptional gift for arcane arts for martial purposes, believe it or not. Which kinda goes hand in hand with the Warrior of Light demonstrating bravery, since a good leader can demonstrate courage by way of example, thus being able to fight competently is quite valuable. And Emeric shows how important it is to have strong beliefs and ideals when running a nation, but not to take them to the extreme like Alphinaud had done, by being able to temper those thoughts and think rationally. Basically, that it's important to have values, but not to the point that you become a zealot and that you are able to think level-headed still. He also learned from the relationship between the Warrior of Light and Fourchenault that there are those who, despite living to serve, express true love to both those around them as well as for their nation. All four of these characters teach him very important leadership qualities, and through the events of Heavensward and Stormblood, he realizes that being a leader isn't some endgame goal to aspire to, like when he initially rode up to Eorzea, but rather that it's a burden that you shouldn't accept lightly unless you are ready for it.
Uldar has taken control of its future, and I must do the same.
And once he goes in with this mindset of accepting leadership as that sort of a burden, we see him become an effective leader. Through his humbling, overcoming those traumatic experiences, observing figures that he looks up to, by Shadowbringers then, we end up with someone who is a character nearly unrecognizable from the one he started as, because he took the time to reflect on his past failures and try to reflect on his journey with those people and understand them. And again, the way this was done slowly, albeit surely, over the course of A Realm Reborn, Heavensward and Stormblood, over the course of multiple years, is why he became such a beloved character. That is them taking full advantage of how large the F14 story is and playing that to their benefit, and I love that. Something I also give them huge props for is how they handled him becoming more mature and experienced. See, it would have been easy to just have him become more mature by having him become incredibly stoic. And I have the perfect character to compare to, because this same character shows us simultaneously how to do it properly and how to do it wrong. That character would be Sansa Stark. In the show, the way Sansa's growth is portrayed is that her compassion, her altruistic views and other noble traits that are opened up are weaknesses and something that's gotta be suppressed. So by the end of the show, she's become basically an asshole, cold-hearted, emotionless, almost like a robot. Because that's what these two chuckle fucks envisioned her character growth to logically be. They wanted her to turn into Littlefinger 2.0, except it ended up being even worse. Needless to say, this is some real smooth brain levels of writing. Sansa in the books, on the other hand, well, her story is still very much ongoing and she's quite young in the books still, but from the direction we've seen her character go, it seems to me that the compassion and genuine care she has for other people, despite what it might cost her or her own feelings, is and will be emphasized in her growth by her becoming smarter, not in a sense of her becoming an asshole like in the show, but by her being a better judge of character and having more experience in regards to knowing when and where that compassion is needed. And so it is for Alphinaud. Instead of having him become some stone-cold badass or whatever nonsense, they instead put emphasis on his good qualities that came to the forefront during Our Realm Reborn and Heavensward. His altruistic views, his compassion, and how he learned to make better use of them. In fact, they went the complete opposite of trying to make him badass. After his mask of not less than the salvation of the star is shattered, underneath we see someone who is actually quite relatable in that Alphinaud is quite clumsy and goofy at times.
Thank you, Kryl.
For what? I haven't finished yet. Would you care to attempt a more dexterous deflection?
Mayhap we should save this delightful conversation for a more fitting occasion, when pressing matters do not demand our undivided attention.
What, and you're going to swim there, are you?
'Tis the quickest way, and you may rest assured I've been practicing. Yeah! Ever the scholar, Y'shtola dedicated herself to studying ancient civilizations of the First, befriending a tribe known as the Knights Blessed in the process. There she took on the name of Matoya and won the respect of all the children of the forest.
Which often results in some funny moments, and goddamn does it make him way more appealing by giving him some very flavorful character personality. Because of course he would be clumsy, he's just a kid after all, a nerdy kid at that. He blurts out something awkward in a conversation, he overthinks something, he might make a comment while being completely oblivious to the mood within the room, he sucks at swimming, he's terrible at spending money, doing dumb things like spending a big portion of the Scion's funds to buy a katana without much foresight. I could keep going, but my point is that there are many of these sorta minor flaws to Alphinaud's character and it makes him much more appealing as a result.
この枯れ果てた荒野からリンクパール通信が届くかどうかわからない。それでも今日君に向けて伝えよう。私が初めてエオルゼアを訪れた時、かの地の人々はそれぞれが大きな問題を抱え一つになれずにいた。私はそれをもどかしく思い、偉大な祖父の後に続かんと救済に奔走した。それがすでにおごりであるとも知らずに。ああ、まったく まったく。君にも大変な世話をかけてしまった。それでも共に行動し、旅をし、私に教えてくれた君に今改めて感謝をしている。できれば面と向かって言いたいところだが、本当にありがとう。私たちの道行きは今度こそ人が手を取り合う未来につながっている。私はそれを信じていくよ。君もきっとエオルゼアのため、いや世界のために今も奔走していることだろう。再会できるその日までお互い全力を尽くそうじゃないか。すまない。こんな寂しい場所にいるせいか妙に感傷的になってしまったね。ただどうしてもこの日に君に伝えたかったんだ。
Stormblood was big for Alphinaud, though it's mostly background stuff and maybe not as noticeable as Heavensward. He grows in those aspects I talked about previously. He becomes essentially the leader of the Scions, showing that he's more than capable of filling those shoes after Minfilia is gone. The experience on the road with Estinian allowed him to see much more practical matters instead of just broad things, which he uses on a few occasions, such as during his visit at the House of the Fears, where he solved quite a few of the myriad shortages that the rebels were facing, both leading up to and during the assault on Doma Castle. Following this, he lays out an effective battle plan to take Doma Castle, showing his skills as a tactician. He has a little adventure into the drowned city of Scala together with Arenvold and the Warrior Flight, something that'll come back around later. During this, he also plays a coin keeper to Alamigo and helps distribute the gold found during their foray into the Mad King's Trove. Even though it's a little subtle, I love this neat little detail because it makes a lot of sense when you stop to think about it. See, Alphinaud did mess up big time when he wasted the Scion's funds on purchasing that overly expensive katana without putting much foresight into it. And sometime later, we see him help distribute the loot found in Scala. This is just not a nice bit of development showing that he's once again learning from his mishaps, but also I think this makes perfect sense. In Stormblood in particular, Alphinaud is established to be quite sharp when it comes to taking control of the logistics side of things as he did in Doma, and the guy in general is obviously quite smart, especially book smart, as well as diplomatic. It then stands to reason that he would be efficient in making sure that this sudden influx of gold is distributed in a way that best benefits the entire nation, making sure that money goes exactly where it's needed. But this doesn't necessarily mean that Alphinaud knows how to make smart purchases personally, or that he's a good consumer, so to speak. So the funny thing is that despite him being a coin keeper, he's still prone to spending his own money, or money given to him, like an idiot. I love it. He also gains a lot of courage through the hardships in the expansion, which culminates in his daring decision to leave to Garlemald in 4.3, something that the OG Alphinaud would have never done. Nah, the OG Alphinaud would have tried to send someone in his stead instead or tried to weasel his way out of it somehow, but through such a big decision we see his growth on full display. Alphinaud, ever the diplomat, decides to go almost completely alone to the dreadful and dark Garlean Empire. It's a shame that that trip never properly took off. And then we are already on to Shadowbringers.
What say you, old friend? Hungry for another adventure? And so we take to the road once more.
Alphinaud's story follows a very logical progression in Shadowbringers, as it is here where he is presented with arguably the biggest obstacles he ever had to face up until this point, and over the course of the story, we see just how much he has grown and continues to grow as a character. The writers basically make Eomer and Alphinaud more or less intertwined. It is essentially an obstacle that he has to overcome, and when he does so, his character gets a nice conclusion with the Shadowbringers story in 5.3 as a new arc begins for him in Endwalker. There's 3 key points here, ways in which Alphinaud interacts with Eomer. 1. The citizens of Eomer themselves. 2. Votri and what he represents, and 3. His relationship with the Chais. When we go into Shadowbringers, we see that Alphinaud hasn't been able to accomplish much. It's been a year, and he still hasn't been able to enter the city proper. I actually like this a lot. Unlike for the other characters that are well acquainted with their respective environment, those being Urianger, Y'shtola and Analysing, Alphinaud knows a lot less about Eomer by comparison. This not only puts Eomer into perspective on how difficult it is to get into, but I also appreciate that the developers did it this way so we can see his reactions to Eomer and its society through our adventure, instead of it already being all pre-established stuff. This also perfectly feeds into Alphinaud's character. He pretty much tells us that a big reason he has only recently put in motion a plan to enter the city itself is because he was much more concerned with helping people outside of Eomer. The 99% that I talk about in the Shadowbringers analysis video, the farmers, peasants and poor folk that are suffering due to Eomer. Because of course he would make it a priority to help those people first. Even if arguably a more rational way would be to focus on getting yourself into Eomer and start trying to change it from within to address the root of the problem. But that's just how Alphinaud is. He cannot turn his back on those less fortunate individuals. He is pretty easily able to discern how BS the whole Eomer situation is, how it looks far better on the outside than what it's gonna look on the inside. He then gets to experience just how bad the situation really is, and correctly assesses that there isn't much more they can do in Eomer, so he leaves with the Warrior of Light. This introduction to him is really good. We see how much he cares about the people of Colusia, how he's been wasting no time in trying to help them to the best of his ability. He's very touched to see the Warrior of Light and worried about the crew back home like the Taru. We see the humble beginnings of his relationship with the Chais, and goddamn, I did not expect such a sick burn from Alphinaud out of all characters. Having Shadowbringers open up like this, seeing Alphinaud and having him be tied to Eomer was such a good ass design choice, and by the time you leave Eomer and have recruited Alphinaud, you really feel just how much he's grown and how awesome he is. Another thing that is very much on display here is that compassion and empathy that Alphinaud has towards other people that he gained back in Heavensward, but it's here in Shadowbringers where we see it truly realized to its full potential. You have this blue-haired thief, Kai Shear, who steals these gems Alphinaud had procured by befriending the Ondo. It was a carefully laid plan where he would use those gems to his advantage to get into Eomer. But the plan goes to shit because they openly talk about it in the open, in broad daylight. Well, I guess ain't nothing else going on in this world, but you get the idea. Kai Shear is a good case example of just how bad the situation in Eomer is. People will go to any lengths to get past those gates, even resorting to thievery, and I wouldn't be surprised if even worse things happened regularly. We then catch him, and after the man proclaims how desperate he is to enter Eomer because his friends are there, Alphinaud, upon thinking on the situation, comes to the conclusion that they can always find another way inside and that helping out this poor man is the best option. He then shares his plans with him and Kai Shear thanks him. Let's put this into perspective, right? You just spent however long coming up with this plan, currying favor with the Ondo, until they were willing to trade some really valuable items with you, all so that you can throw it all away because of a random guy who doesn't matter at all, and thus you risk your entire mission, your purpose of coming to not just this place, but to this world to save it. You know, saving 2 worlds and the Warrior of Light. But he chooses to save this random guy because he realizes that someone in his position could very easily die at any moment in this awful world, and thus he went to save the life of someone less fortunate than him. Not only does this fit into one of the themes that I talk about in my Shadowbringers analysis, in how we decide to save a single person's life, side character even, despite there being the much easier option of just screwing him over and doing what we came here to do, but it's also perfectly indicative of Alphinaud's character, someone who chooses to show compassion, even if it might seem irrational to some. The same thing also happens when you go liberate Ilmor. Votri escapes and you, the warrior of light, try to go after him, but Alphinaud stops you.
That is Mount Gulg, the highest peak in Calusia. It lies on the other side of a sheer cliff, and much as I wish it were otherwise, it is beyond our reach for now. But even if it weren't, there are people here who need our help.
Oh, Alphinaud.
Please, even if it's only to tend to their wounds.
These people need our help. I love this so much. Alphinaud has been in this world for a year, watching this clown fiesta go on for that entire duration within Ilmor, and just recently he found out that it's even worse than what he initially thought. How many of you in this situation would just say, screw those guys, expecting it to be a waste of time to deal with them, as messed up as they are? I freely admit that I myself would have literally just moved on without a second thought. These people are absolute degenerates, spending their life in bliss, knowing it caused so much suffering onto others, so they can live a life of sloth. There is no point to stop and reason with these people, because chances are that they will either vehemently disagree with what you say anyway, or worse yet, try to attack you for trying to change their way of life. Just try to find a way to stop Votri and move on with your mission. But I guess that's why I'm not a good fit to be in these stories like Alphinaud. He basically goes, no, we won't leave these people behind, they need our help. It really takes a lot to be able to say that in such a dire and desperate situation. He delivers this wonderful speech where he basically gives these people a bashing, telling them that Votri's bullcrap doesn't absolve them of the misery they have caused, the crimes against humanity they committed for their own personal gain. The party has helped the afflicted, and he said his piece. And this is the amazing part, even though he implores them to join together and join them in helping save the world, he fully goes in expecting that nothing will come out of it, so while yes, he does show compassion, he isn't being that dumbass naive kid he used to be. He has full grasp of the situation and understands that these people will probably never join him, not because he fears they wouldn't listen, but because he understands how beaten down and broken these people are, and how hard it would be for them to recover. Because of course he would think that way. He too was a dreamer who was one day snapped into reality, accompanied by great loss. So he understands the situation better than anyone. But unbeknownst to him, it was through his acts of kindness and selflessness that these people warmed up to the idea of helping them out. They saw in Alphinaud and the group people that were willing to help others, even such selfish individuals such as them, and it was basically through his speech that a few were motivated, and then it became a chain reaction as more and more people offered their help in turn. It is here where the culmination of those observations and lessons he learned on leadership finally pay off big time, as he puts them into practice more or less intuitively, unknowingly. And that, my friends, is how you get some real good-ass character development going. And yes, this scene is awesome. One could easily brush it aside as just a generic speech and getting a city to help them, but the way it's presented both through the Ilmorns becoming people that proactively try to mend these issues themselves, as well as through Alphinaud's character growth, is what makes it awesome.
Peace assumes many forms, and I do not doubt that you considered yours well worth the cost. I was even prepared to believe that the end might justify the means. Ignorant as I was, I had hoped that you might mend your ways and join hands with us, that we might strive together for the happiness of all. But no more.
Your actions cannot be reconciled with your words. Peace for all, you say? Yet when you were threatened, your first act was to sacrifice your own people in order to save yourself. If your paradise can be rebuilt so long as you alone survive, it exists not for the people. It exists solely for your twisted pleasure.
So let's talk about Alphinaud and Vautry. A big part of Alphinaud's characters here in Shadowbringers is him figuring out who is worthy of his compassion. We saw with Kai Shear that he genuinely felt it was the best choice to trade his plans to save this man's life. We saw it with the citizens of Ilmore, where even though these people were people that committed horrible acts unto others, he felt they were worth giving a second chance to. But the most interesting case is with Vautry. For all the horrible things he has done, for how much of a sick bastard he is, Alphinaud still doesn't immediately condemn him to die for his crimes. Rather, he actually proposes to him a better path, a path of redemption, to use his power for the good and help save this world. This is so wonderfully written, because you could argue that what he's saying is very much irrational, and indeed I would agree with that assessment, but this right here, more than anything else, shows who Alphinaud Leveilleur really is. It doesn't matter who you are or what you have done, he tries to always see the best in people and truly believes that people can make mistakes and to do better in life through learning from those mistakes and getting that second chance. And so he gives even Vautry, a man most vile, that option, that he would mend his ways and join hands with them, that they might strive together for the happiness of all, as he put it. Because he sees in Vautry much of himself. He too used to have this mentality of ends justifying the means and having grand illusions and thinking the world is centered around you and you alone, in that you are the sole person who holds the answer to all the world's woes. Then he grew out of it and became a better person for it. Ergo, he hopes the same for Vautry. But it is then through the experiences of Mount Gulk and him getting to reflect more on it, there comes a point in which what someone says does absolutely not correlate with their actions. That someone is so full of shit that what they say is immediately dispelled when you look at what they are actually doing in contrast to what they are claiming. This was that moment for Alphinaud. This man advocates for peace, yet he chose to deliberately sacrifice his people the moment his life was even remotely in danger. It is at this point, just before you go fight innocents, where Alphinaud basically goes, "No, enough is enough. I am not taking your BS anymore. You aren't worthy of my compassion. The only thing left is to end your miserable life." And the last thing he says to Vautry, "With your powers, you could have done so much good." Talk about a gut punch. This piece of dialogue is totally optional, but you absolutely can't miss it, because it makes this whole thing come full circle. Alphinaud isn't happy that it's all over, rather he's lamenting the fact that Vautry had all that power, he was such a charismatic and effective leader, and he chose to use that power for nothing. Heck, you could argue it was even worse than nothing. He chose to actively oppress and torment countless people. Like, I'm not even talking about how he was contributing to this world ending in a concrete way, because that's something non-tangible. I am talking about all the lives that he either ruined or ended. And it's through this experience that Alphinaud basically learns to better evaluate which people are and are not worthy of his compassion. And I thought that bit of his character was done rather beautifully. In addition, in Shadowbringers, you got these two characters from Ilmore, Chai Nuz and Dulia Chai. I reckon it is through them that Alphinaud was able to have a semblance of faith in Ilmore. At a first glance, we are led to assume that these are gonna be your typical selfish, asshole-ish aristocrats, and even though they were complicit in all the horrible things happening in Ilmore, they were nevertheless loving and caring individuals. It's just that the horrible circumstances of the state of the world and the systems in place were what led them to indulge in this twisted dream of theirs. The two make for awesome parent figures to Alphinaud, Though you could argue they weren't parent figures in a traditional sense, since honestly Alphinaud lectured them and grew them more than vice versa. I guess what I mean to say more is that they express affection towards him that one might expect from a parent to a child. Dulia Chai in particular shows a lot of maternal love for Alphinaud. You could argue that Edmond was also a father figure of sorts to him, but I feel it was much more prevalent here. Anyway, I found the relationship between the Chais and Alphinaud to be quite endearing, and it really added to his story, seeing him finally receive some loving parent figures. Not that he didn't have any in the past, since Amelians, Louisoix and Fourchenault all loved him. It's just that going through the story, this is the first time we as players get to see him have some proper parent figures loving him. I would also mention that through Chai news, he also learns once again some really nice leadership experience by seeing the way he builds up Ilmor in 5.1, plus those farewells he had at the end of 5.3. I know it can get drowned out in all the other amazing things happening there, but like all those other farewells in 5.3, emotions were really high in that scene for sure. What we have by the end of Shadowbringers is someone who is a friend we can lean on, someone we share an intimate bond with, someone we are lucky to have traveling with us due to his exceptional set of skills, essentially a person you are proud to call your ally, your comrade in arms, your friend through thick and thin. And Alphinaud can see himself as someone who can be proud to follow in his grandfather's legacy, rather than someone ashamed to do so.
Then let it be recorded that on this day, the Grand Company of Eorzea was born.
If all that wasn't enough, we still have Endwalker to cover, so let's do just that. Of course, we already did go over a lot of the backstory that we'll learn from 5.4 through 6.0, but there is still a lot to discuss in terms of what happens in the present. Endwalker follows a pretty logical progression to Alphinaud's character, but there's still quite a few things I want to talk about. Right after Shadowbringers ends, things are looking up for him. The Scions, thanks largely to his sister's contributions, are able to find a cure for the tempering, and the city-states seize this opportunity to mend their relation with the beast tribes. This, combined with the appearance of a new threat in the form of the Telephoroi, makes the city-states more eager to unite and fight their common enemy as one. Eimeric proposes a name for this new group, and the Warrior of Light suggests calling them the Grand Company of Eorzea, the very same name that Alphinaud had intended to call his United Grand Company if his Crystal Braves idea had worked out. Naturally, this makes Alphinaud incredibly happy, given that this is exactly what he came to do when he initially rode up to Eorzea, and now it's finally happening. Kane Senna asks Alphinaud to share his failures with the Crystal Braves in order to make use of his experience to help build this new Grand Company of Eorzea. Alphinaud reacts pretty positively to this prospect, and really, who wouldn't? Regrettable though his past failures were, that ordeal can finally be put to good use, and it's his chance at making things right, make up for his mistakes, as it were. So you have this pretty wholesome bit where Alphinaud compliments the report he wrote after the incident with the viewpoints of others involved, and it's really the perfect thing to lead him into Endwalker. So, we've talked about quite a few characters throughout this video, but there's two that are important to Alphinaud's story that I have neglected to mention so far. Cryle is one of them. To be honest, I wish I had spoken more about this in my Cryle video, but as mentor to the twins, she does act like a big sister figure at times to both of them, and we most definitely see her do that to Alphinaud. Sure, she likes to bully Alphinaud, but she also really cares about him and demonstrates a certain level of admiration for how dedicated Alphinaud really is to his ideals. Another character I wanted to mention is Arenvald, whom I mentioned briefly during the Stormblood segment. See, the reason Alphinaud easily befriends Arenvald is because, as I mentioned during the backstory segment, when Alphinaud was young, he really struggled to make any friendships with boys around his age, because he saw himself as above them, and always wanted to be in charge. Now that he's been humbled, he's able to form those kinds of friendships. When it comes to people like Estinian, the warrior of light and the like, it's worth mentioning that those are individuals he more looks up to and feels eternal gratitude for, but with someone like Ironvold, he's simply a friend. I've heard people express that they wished their friendship was explored more, but I think we got sufficient enough in-game to get the point. Not to mention that their friendship is explored more in Endwalker. I for one find it pretty meaningful that if you choose Alphinaud to have a private convo with just before the final days, he mentions that he is still staying in touch with Ironvold by writing him letters all throughout the Endwalker story. Likewise, if you do the healer role quests, you get to see what Ironvold is up to, and he mentioned Alphinaud a few times, plus you get a really satisfying conclusion to his story in that questline. So yeah, pretty much what happens here is that Ironvold gets wrecked in the Pageltan Tower, and he loses his ability to walk, which is just, well, he's an adventurer who is now crippled. Just try to imagine how awful that is. That's like having a singer who can no longer sing. On top of this, Fourchenault rode up to Gridania as a representative of the Forum and disowned both Alphinaud and Analysing, with Alphinaud being completely helpless and unable to retort any of his points. Naturally, both of these points combined are pretty devastating to Alphinaud, and who can blame him? That's pretty messed up. So he starts to doubt himself here. I know I'm jumping around the order of events a bit, but Kryle comes in clutch by recruiting Estinian, thus lifting up his spirits, which is where that big sister role is coming into play. You also have everyone, most importantly including Ironvold, reminding Alphinaud that even if he might doubt himself, he made it this far, and did so with flying colors while inspiring others on the way and bettering people's lives.
A less than daunting prospect, judging by your expression. Could it be that you've dispelled your lingering doubts, Alphinaud?
Oh, I doubt I ever will. But as my friends have kindly reminded me, I have come this far, and that must count for something.
Gods be good, Alphinaud. That's what we've been trying to tell you all along.
For one so bright, you can be remarkably dim at times. There is such a thing as overthinking, you know.
I love this because there exists a notion that those who possess higher intelligence tend to overthink a lot. You may have heard of this quote from Bertrand Russell: "The trouble with the world is that the stupid are cocksure and the intelligent are full of doubt. An intelligent person is more prone to doubt their abilities and perhaps even lead them into thinking that they aren't competent enough in a given situation, resulting in their analytical mind creating this loop of thinking where they ponder over every minute detail, hence overthinking." And this is what you see happening here with Alphinaud. From the outside looking in, it might seem a little baffling that, given all the amazing deeds he has either been part of or has even directly accomplished throughout the game's story, that he finds himself lacking. In fact, even after being cheered up, he straight up states he reckons he will never not have those lingering doubts. But it all starts to make sense when you take into account this point I just made and realize it from his perspective. I know I am dedicating a lot of time talking about this, given that in the grand scheme of things, it's a relatively minor aspect of his character, but I want to show some appreciation for adding this neat and subtle detail because it shows that the writers know how an intelligent person like Alphinaud would think, and if you don't believe me that you need to be smart to write a smart character, we can simply jump back over to Game of Thrones and look at Tyrion and realize how that character became butchered the moment it was written by these two morons once they ran out of source material. And speaking in general, writing witty characters is difficult, and often writers fall into different kinds of traps. Bullshit trickery to make the character appear smarter than the audience. How this ties into Alphinaud is that I appreciate how we have an individual who possesses a high intelligence, but it all feels very organic and they behave how you might expect someone of his background and learning to behave. He's a smart character done properly. It is also perhaps ironic that when I was making the script for this video, I was redoing and restructuring it a lot, because Alphinaud is such an important character, and I was worried that I couldn't do his character justice, causing me to doubt the script and the content. So Alphinaud doubting himself is hella relatable to me. Though don't mistake that as me pretending I got the smarts. Hell, I wish I'd possess even 1/3 of Alphinaud's intelligence. And that's just how life is when a 16-year-old fictional character is infinitely smarter than you. Anyway, I went a bit off on a tangent. Let's finally talk about Endwalker. In 6.0, Alphinaud, like all the characters on the main cast, have many awesome and emotional moments in the story, and while I would like to gush about every single one of them, I rather this video gets released before 2023, so I will only focus on a handful of things here. On the surface, Garlemald is just another location, another country with infinite problems that Alphinaud has to visit and deal with, but it's a unique experience even for him, due to Garlemald being this ruinous state where its people have been fed propaganda their entire life and resent the Eorzeans. He gets to feel the full effect of this when he simply tries to help out a couple of individuals and they rather run off in a suicidal effort and bleed to death near a frozen lake. Also the feels when you realize that he is referring to Eorzea's dream with this line. More importantly, however, he then encounters the legatus of the First Legion, Quintus, and has this little exchange with him.
We wish to help you. Let us help you. If there is aught that can be done to ease your plight, we would be glad to do it.
Perhaps you would. But regardless of the ideals you espouse, your leaders would not send an army into Garlemald if they did not stand to benefit. If we accept their aid, they will expect their efforts to be rewarded once the Telophoroi are no longer a threat. And after compensation and concessions, the great empire would be brought to heel. Her enemies rejoice at her downfall. Our third eye, a mark of shame. Answer me this, young peacemakers. If a world without conflict is your desire, why reject the unity and prosperity of Garlemald? Is it because we do not share your faith? That we do not share your heritage? That our ideals and virtues differ? That we cherish and hold in the highest that which you do not? Disparity is the root of discord, and peace built on compromise is flawed and fleeting. Happiness for one and all is a dream, and the reality is that to the victor go the spoils. That is why we Garleans will never submit nor surrender. For freedom and for pride, we will remain true to ourselves until the bitter end. That is my hope.
You would generally see two ways of responding to this. One way is to look at how Quintus, as a high-ranking officer in the Garlean military, would be someone incredibly prone to propaganda and to the doctrine taught by Garlemald. Thus, his point of view could be seen as narrow-minded. You also have the fact that he is from an older generation which gravitates some towards believing that their worldview could be archaic, from another era. Because keep in mind that a lot has changed in the FF14 world in the past half a century. The player is especially hard-pressed to listen to him because of them seeing the atrocities committed by Garlemald throughout the expansions, and with him being the enemy, if you know what I mean. On the other hand, You would have individuals who would accept what he's saying due to the exact same reason of him being old, since that can also be translated into being wise and experienced, or people who share his beliefs, either because they genuinely believe in them as well, or because they too have been affected by the Garlean doctrine to that extent, which, well, I guess those two are the same thing, but you get the idea. My point is that the vast majority of people will either outright dismiss what he's saying, or outright accept what he's saying. Alphinaud does neither. You remember what I said back in the Heavensward segment, that when he got humbled, he stopped to observe those around him, trying to look for qualities that he could adopt in his efforts towards becoming a better leader himself. Well, he never stopped doing that, and we see that in action here, because not only does he make one observation, he makes two.
I won't deny that we lack the experience of people such as Father or Quintus. Perhaps they've come to see the world as a series of problems, and the most efficient way of solving them, to reduce everything to fundamental forms. A stone is a stone, a cloud, a flower, no more than that. Simple descriptions that strip the subject of distinguishing characteristics. A man is a man, divided according to race, creed, or allegiance, and to some, defined by such associations.
Is that what you think?
In my misbegotten youth. But what I believed wisdom was no more than aggressive ignorance. I've since learned to look beyond the banners and the politics, to see people as individuals with their own hopes and dreams. As for my dream of building a better world, well, every day I'm reminded that it is far more complex than I had ever imagined. But it only spurs me onward, to find the wisdom and the strength to see it through to the very end.
One of the observations he makes is that people like Quintus or his father have what could be described as an overly analytical approach in life. That in seeing the world as a series of problems and finding the most efficient ways to solve them, they ended up losing themselves in abstract thinking. See, abstract thinking is a powerful analytical tool that you can and should use, but it's a dangerous thing to rely on abstractions exclusively, because they are merely a simplification of reality and aren't always appropriate depending on the situation. Because in order to have a comprehensive understanding of reality, what you need is the ability to grasp both abstract thinking and the concrete. So, the observation that Alphinaud makes here is that people such as Quintus and Fourchenault, through their worldviews, ended up going too far into the abstract world and forgetting the concrete as a result. He also notes how he himself used to view the world similarly, concluding that it was aggressive ignorance rather than genuine wisdom. It was through Alphinaud becoming more compassionate throughout Heavensward that he realized that when looking past the politics, banners and ideologies, what you see are people with their own hopes, values and aspirations. There's even a word for this, as John Koenig describes in the Dictionary of Obscure Sorrows, Sonder, which is basically the realization that each random passerby is living a life as vivid and complex as your own. So you could say that in Heavensward, Alphinaud experienced this moment of Sonder. Alphinaud even finishes this thought process in a way that can be described as perfectly Alphinaud, even though he realizes that the dream he had of building a better world is far more complex than he had ever imagined, something that he will probably never achieve during his lifespan. He nevertheless chooses to keep trying to achieve that dream, because that is Alphinaud. He is idealistic, he's a dreamer, and that's what makes him so lovable. When my friend was playing through the MSQ, he noted that what Alphinaud describes here reminded him of the book Intellectuals and Society by author Thomas Sowell. If I can really TLDR this book, it talks about intellectuals, whom Dr. Sowell describes as people who earn a living by making a final product this product being ideas, essentially. It looks at the general patterns of intellectuals over the last 2 centuries and, among other things, acts as a way to show the pitfalls that these intellectuals fell into, so you can use it as a way to learn from them. One theme in this book concerns pretty much the same topic as Alphinaud discusses here. Let me show you some small bits from interviews from Dr. Sowell regarding this book where he talks about this topic.
That's a tough one to encapsulate, but the basic confusion is between statistical categories and flesh and blood people. It's true that if you look at the percentage of the income that went to the top 20% and some year A, and then later on, a decade later, you'll find that that percentage has gone up. And you say, well, that shows a disparity between the people. And so you're comparing what happens to these abstract categories rather than what's happening to actual flesh and blood people.
So there's an enormous amount of churn and dynamism within the American.
And almost everybody's own personal life. I mean, look, what were you making when you were 20 years old compared to what you were making when you were 40?
Negative. I was spending my parents' money when I was 20 years old, right? Okay.
Significant in themselves, but in the aggregate, you can see the tendency of this. The people who think they know better and they ought to be telling us what to do, those people are the danger. And if you don't see that, then I'm not sure what the future is going to be like.
There, Dr. Sowell was describing the thing that intellectuals like Fourchenault were doing in the first clip regarding economics, and in the second, reminding people that those who think they know better and tell us what we ought to do are the danger, which is quite similar to the realization that Alphinaud comes to in that Garlemald segment. Furthermore, Dr. Sowell talks about other things that are applicable to Alphinaud's character, such as this point about how the higher your education, the more likely you are to be wrong.
Well, among the many reasons, most academic intellectuals have no experience, no serious experience outside the academy. And not only do they have no experience, they have every incentive to believe that they are brighter than other people and know more than other people because they've been told that all their lives. I mean, you become a top intellectual because you've passed through all these successive filters. You've gotten into the best colleges. You've gotten into the best graduate schools.
Or even from second grade on, the teachers are responding to you as a kid who passes tests especially well.
Yes. Right. And so you have all of that in your background.
What is the pathology of intellectuals that, I mean, one condensation, an unfair, crude condensation, but it sort of gets at a point of this book might be simply, the fancier your education, the more likely you are to be wrong.
Well, the more I would say there's something to that, because the more likely you are to spout off about things you don't know anything about. The problem is that all of us have a narrow range within which we may be great, but a few steps outside that range, and we're totally lost.
Why? What is it about having a fancy diploma that gives people the right to
waffle on? It's not only the diploma, it's all just the general reputation of being an intellectual.
This was obviously a big part of Alphinaud's arc early on, about how he thought he knew the solutions to everything because he grew up to believe that he was right. I'm bringing this up because Alphinaud could very well be considered one of the intellectuals that Dr. Sowell describes in his book, as he ticks many of the boxes. The main difference, however, is that Alphinaud, throughout his journey, learns from these mistakes and is always looking to improve himself, whether that be by learning from his own failures or that of others. So in that sense, this book might be of interest to you, and it's definitely a solid recommend from me. Anyway, to loop back around, I mentioned that Alphinaud made 2 observations. This was one of them. The other was that, like I said at the start, it would have been easy for him to simply dismiss what Quintus says and not give his words any thought. But that's really not the type of a person Alphinaud is. What he does instead is that he attempts to discern which parts of his conversation with Quintus were propaganda-driven nonsense and which parts have true merit to them. He analyzes the conversation and puts it through as a sort of a BS filter, if you will, and tries to find the core message. The message he came to was the truth that whatever ideals individuals may espouse, nations are not moved to action unless they stand to benefit. This moves him to the decision of going to Garlemald. He essentially wants to be a mediator between the fallen empire and the Ilsabard contingent to make sure that the needs of the people come first, to understand their hearts, that they might better help them begin anew. We really see how Garlemald really affected Alphinaud as a character, both through him observing Quintus and coming to realizations through it, but also emotionally. Even at the very end, he still mentions the two sisters and how he's going to keep carrying that burden. And him going to Garlemald at the end is the perfect way to cap off his character arc in the Zodiacs/Heidelin arc. It's a full circle, pretty much. When we started off with him in A Realm Reborn, he was inexperienced, arrogant, incompetent leader who bit off more than he could chew, but someone who did have genuine potential to be a diplomat and help relations. And now that he's weeded out all the bad traits and learned from others throughout his journey, he is in that perfect position to be a strong leader and to help out the people of Garlemald.
I thought you knew better than to raise your voice to your elders. It seems I was wrong. Wrong to ever let you leave, Sharlayan. I consoled myself that your time abroad would instill in you some hint of restraint, of discipline. But I see now that Eorzea has made fools of you both. Have you forgotten why it was that I so vehemently opposed your grandfather's departure? For all his wisdom, his only solution was to go to war. Death, devastation, ruin. Even those who claim victory are scarred for life. What prize could ever justify such sacrifice? It is the duty of the learned to avert such tragedy. By fanning the flames of war, you forsake all you once held dear. I see your friend shares your misguided ideals. But unlike her, you should know better. By espousing such barbaric notions, you subvert the teachings of Sharlayan and place all we have worked for in jeopardy. Alphinaud, Alizé, as of this moment, you shall no longer bear the name of Leveilleur.
What?
Father! How you choose to live your lives is no longer my concern. If you wish to walk the path of ruin, I will not stand in your way.
So, let's talk about Fourchenault. I'm just gonna say it. I liked the portrayal of this character in Endwalker. First off, both the Leveilleur parents have great introductions as characters, and while Amelian's is the topic of the next video, what I can say about Fourchenault's introduction is this. See, the forum could have just sent any random pleb to be the messenger, because it's not like they came there to negotiate or get a treaty, but they chose to send Fourchenault. As a leading member of the forum, the point isn't what he came to say, but rather the point was his very presence. It sends a powerful warning message to both the twins and the Grand Company of Eorzea to not mess with Sharlayan's plans. And this works. The Eorzean leaders don't try to push the matter afterwards. He also works perfectly as a way for the players to get a glimpse into the Sharlayan mindset before visiting the actual place, because Fourchenault is someone who believes in Sharlayan's core values of non-intervention taken to its extreme. In fact, it wouldn't be far off course to label him a fanatic or a zealot. That's how strong his faith is in this philosophy.
To chart the course of history, not to change it. I am familiar with the Sharlayan stance.
It is more than that. It is our way of life. Who we are.
So already we have a powerful message sent to both the Eorzea leaders as well as to you, the player, but we also have to talk about the twins. The game sets up this scenario where Grahatia is suspicious of how they sent Fourchenault all this way just to disown his children and tell the GC of Eorzea that Sharlayan can't be arsed. It leads the player into assuming that Fourchenault was putting up an act in order to protect his children. I believe that this is both true and not true. Let me explain. We find out in Endwalker that it was indeed Louisoix's departure and subsequent death that drove Fourchenault to protect his children at all costs, even as he grew more and more disdain towards his father because of his opposing worldviews. He had this naive belief that maybe his father of all people would be able to save his children, and so it was this belief that made him think that he in turn should stubbornly keep Alphinaud and Analysing close. But that belief came crumbling down when Louisoix gave his life to fight Bahamut at Cardinal. And with that came the realization that he shouldn't let anything interfere with his mission to save his children, or he would lose his loved ones again, this time the two most important ones in his life, meaning even if his children would detest him, he would get them on the ship to save them. This gives a pretty clear motive for him disowning the twins, but I think it's more nuanced than that, because I'd like to believe that we're dealing with characters that are three-dimensional. Think back to the first segment in this video after the intro, where I went over the history of the Levelier family. Try to picture it from the perspective of Fourchenault. He is someone who genuinely loves his country. He loves the ideals of his country, as mentioned earlier, even to the point that one could consider him a zealot. He was born into a family in his country that has arguably the strongest roots to those beliefs. These beliefs have dictated his very way of life for a huge part of his life. So in comes his father, someone whom he looks up to, not just because he is his father, but because he is genuinely a man with boundless wisdom, and openly tells him that these beliefs that he has lived his entire life according to are wrong, that believing in those values makes him indolent. So naturally, he starts to grow resentment towards his father. Not only does Louisoix's active defiance of Charlene's policies bring dishonor to the family name and the prestigious roots they come from, but they are also in direct violation of the morals that he believes in. Then his father dies fighting for the thing that he believed in. Sure, he became a hero and a legend for saving Eorzea, but we gotta keep this in perspective. Does that really matter to Fourchenault though? As I mentioned in my Shadowbringers analysis, this is something that some people simply struggle to cope with. There are people who simply do not care about the legacy someone leaves behind. They just wanted to spend more time with their loved ones. So even though Fourchenault became bitter towards his father over time, he still loved him, and him dying for the sake of some faraway land probably didn't exactly help the situation. And if you remember, Analysing struggled to overcome the very same thing. She was livid when she first showed up in Eorzea and saw the land that her grandfather gave his life to defend. But that's not the worst part. The worst part is that his family feud didn't end with Louisoix's death, it merely moved it over to the youngest generation. So this battle of ideologies that he had been waging against his father is now something that he has to contend with once again, but this time with his own children. The thought that he might forever struggle to truly meet eye to eye with his children for the rest of his life is no doubt something that tormented Fourchenault greatly. Because I don't believe for a second that he wanted his own children to be in the same position that he had to be in, having to oppose their father whom they loved. So his children wished to depart to Eorzea of their own volition. Fourchenault argued with them for months about their plan, but in the end, he would come to accept their decision because he came to hope that in so doing, they would change their point of view. The first time they meet in person after their departure is in 5.5. And this exchange is so similar to the one that took place 5 years ago that I would be surprised if all three involved did not get some sense of deja vu. I am not being hyperbolic either. The twins even react the exact same way. Alphinaud, though understanding of Fourchenault's perspective, is unable to form any words and stays silent, just as with Louisoix, and Analysing getting pissed at Alphinaud for doing nothing in turn. I also find it hilarious that there is a dialogue choice where you can respond to Fourchenault using the exact same words that Louisoix did. Obviously this line is iconic, and having it here as an option makes sense, but it's hilarious because of how the Warrior of Light thinks they can influence the situation by copy-pasting the words used by Eorzea 5 years ago, words that didn't work then, and they sure as hell won't now. Mind you, I don't think it's bad writing, quite the contrary, I think it's brilliant, because it really emphasizes how the Warrior of Light has absolutely zero sway over this conversation. And it is here where I believe that Fourchenault's reaction is 100% genuine. When you take this scene at face value and disconnect it from everything else, sure, it's plausible that he was faking it for the sake of protecting them, but when you really take in all the context into account, I think it's much more reasonable and an infinitely more humane response that he really was disappointed about the fact that the twins kept spouting the exact same rhetoric that Eorzea did all those years ago. In Endwalker, we find out that even his colleagues took notice how much the differences between him and his father agonized him. If even his bloody colleagues can spot it, you know it must have been bad. And remember that this is something that has been festering for years and across multiple generations. It must have been gnawing at him more and more as time passed on. And here we see what is essentially the boiling point, the straw that finally breaks the camel's back. So he essentially says screw all of this and tells his kids they can do whatever the hell they want, but they'll no longer bear dishonor on their family. An impulsive decision, but an easy to understand one. You might even say predictable. But you might say, wait, didn't he just tell us in Endwalker that he did this intentionally to protect the twins and get them onto the ship? He did indeed. But I would like to remind that these characters should ideally have multiple layers to them, like actual human beings instead of simple black and white. My interpretation is that in here, his decision to disown his children was completely authentic, as in, he did go into this conversation hoping that the twins would have changed their minds. And most likely what he planned to do afterwards if they didn't, was going ahead and executing the Great Exodus, and in so doing, he would have proven to them that the principle set by their homeland was the correct one all along, thus settling this age-old debate once and for all. But wait, you might add, does this not make him a shitty father for not being more open-minded towards his children and wanting to prove them wrong like this? Yes. See, I do have some sympathy for Fourchenault. I do think that he was someone who got dealt a bit of a shitty hand by having a few unfortunate circumstances happen to him. But, and the game even emphasizes this at one point, his decisions were still 100% made of his own volition. It's also obvious by how he acts that he is very much an authoritative parent, not much different from, say, Ranjit. So yes, not only was he an absent father overconsumed by work, but he was also way too stubborn, particularly in not budging at all when it came to his viewpoints and towards his children. He also disowns his children because he was so disappointed in them, which is like among the most cunt moves you can do as a parent to your children, pulling the "you are not my son" card, if you know what I mean. The main reason he isn't as bad as someone like Ranjit or other god-awful fathers in the FF series though, is because he did eventually come around and redeem himself. And the work that he prioritized over his children was a major contribution in literally saving the entire universe. But regardless of those 2 points, I don't blame anyone for still judging him and finding him a genuinely bad father. And that was why I said at the start I like him as a character. Because often in this series, you have either really wholesome top-tier amazing fathers who show unending love towards their family, or the literal opposite, where you have fathers that were basically the scum of the earth. Hell, even FF14 itself has this divide, where you have amazing dads like Edmond and Tancred, but on the other hand, you got the worst of the worst with fathers like Varys or Ranjit. What I like about Fourchenault is that he sits somewhere in the middle. And I think that's interesting, because parenting is hard, it's brutal work. I am not one myself, but if anyone watching this has a child of their own, you can let me know. I am just writing off of second-hand experiences here. You see, I am actually somewhat of an uncle myself, and watching my half-sister and my half-brother-in-law raise my niece Even as someone dense as myself can tell that it ain't easy. What I mean to say is that I find it realistic that we see a parent with some real struggles like this, because it's very much plausible. Not all families are all sunshine and rainbows. It's easy to hate his guts because he stands in opposition to the two characters that are amongst the most beloved in the story. But I appreciate Fourchenault as a character because when you stop to take in all the context, you can easily understand why all of this happened. Doesn't mean he gets the Father of the Year award or anything. I just think he was a good addition to the story, especially because of what is about to follow and how he ties into Alphinaud's story in Endwalker. Speaking of which, let's switch perspectives back to Alphinaud. There are two reasons I wanted to talk about Fourchenault a bit more extensively. One is that this goes a long way in explaining Alphinaud's stubbornness. Like, seriously, it runs in the family, trust me. But more importantly, having the full backdrop is crucial in understanding the significance of what Alphinaud managed to achieve in Endwalker. It starts off right after Fourchenault disowns them. Alphinaud, even though he knows his cause is righteous, he can't form the words to retort his father. This was one of the two major reasons for why he ended up doubting himself, the part I was talking about earlier. He gets over it and he eventually travels to Sharlayan. There he goes sniffing around into what the Forum potentially knows about the final days, which upsets his father, who ends up busting them and takes them to the Rostra to stand trial at the Forum's inquiry. During this trial, Alphinaud lets Fourchenault know that even though he hasn't been able to create a compelling argument against what was said back in Gridania, he nonetheless is gonna keep going on his chosen course by weighing the consequence of his every action and allowing his hope for the future to inform his decisions. I like the way this dialogue is worded because he's basically trying to give his statement as much oomph as possible, because Alphinaud knows he doesn't really have a leg to stand on in this argument, so he's just trying to leave the best impression he can. But what is brilliant is that this line of dialogue isn't exactly an empty statement either, because he does eventually follow up on this and prove to his father the merit behind these words. Anyway, before the two can fire off any kind of a debate, the situation is salvaged by Scholark Mondishan, resulting in Alphinaud and his friends being able to stay in Sharlayan. Shortly after, Amelians shows up and gives the twins a set of gifts each. She gives Alphinaud some cool new attire as well as the Nulis and Soul Crystal of his father. Say, Fourchenault used to be a sage, a disciple of Sharlayan origin that is difficult to master, though he gave up on it when he was consumed by his work. Alphinaud using his father's weapon and adopting the same disciple is significant in bridging the gap between father and son, something to remind both of them that while they aren't currently seeing eye to eye, they are still of the same blood. Man, it really is astounding how the writers always manage to make character job changes so damn significant. A lot of story events happen, but the next important event to discuss is when the Sharlayans try to teleport from the Tower of Bab-Il to the moon, during which the final days activate in Garlemald. The situation appears rather bleak, but the Scions show up to save the day. Or rather, as well as can be saved, given the situation. Look, only a lot of people died instead of everyone. Alphinaud uses this opportunity to have the Forum grant them an audience and disclose full details of the Exodus plan as a way to repay the heroism demonstrated by the Scions during the battle. Next, the warrior flight goes over the events at Elpis. Istola suggests that to defeat Meteon, they need to find a way to locate her as well as reach her, where being able to talk to Hydaelyn would clue them in on the former, and being able to use the Sharlayan ship would help achieve the latter. The Scions enter the meeting, during which an issue with the ether burner of the ship is brought to light, that it's not as efficient as they would want it to be, as it's unable to achieve the desired speeds. Alphinaud proposes that the Scions can fix this problem for them, in exchange that they are allowed an audience with Hydaelyn, and that they can propose another use for the ship. The Forum agrees. Once again, let's get into the details a bit and deconstruct this scene properly so we can get a better understanding of what's happening here and why I find this scene so awesome. Remember what Alphinaud said to his father during the trial? I'll put it on screen again in any case. As I said, this statement is quite well worded, but when you boil it down, he's essentially saying, Dad, I don't got a convincing retort, so I must just keep winging it and see what happens. What's great here is that even though it sounds like a hollow statement, he isn't bullshitting his father, nor himself, nor anyone in that room for that matter. Because that is quite literally what he does here. He's quickly adapting to the situation as it changes. All of the things I just described him doing, it isn't pre-planned. He went to Garlemald with the sole intent to aid the people there. It's just that when the opportunity arose, he was quick to take advantage of the situation and see if through Fourchenault they would be able to gain an audience. Well, that worked out, so now he's considering what they should ask, what information of the Exodus can they get that would benefit them in their quest. And then when the Warrior of Light explains the events in Elpis, I can imagine the cogs in Alphinaud's head turning. So they require an audience and a means to travel to the edge of their universe? How convenient that the Forum could potentially offer them both. The question just is, how? How are you going to get them to change course given they've been at this for a very long time now? Keep in mind that Alphinaud and the Scions, though they did commit a great deed, aren't in some super advantageous position all of a sudden. The idea to have them divulge the details of their plans barely worked, and you can imagine that quite a few of the Forum members are still agitated over what happened at the start of the story, and therefore probably aren't that open-minded towards reacting positively to any demands the Scions make. So the only real way to turn this situation around is to attempt to reassure the Forum that not only will you not be a nuisance in their plans anymore, but by ensuring them that you are on their side and can help them, ideally even to the point that they might rely on you. And it's worth mentioning that Alphinaud didn't know how to solve their issue with the ether burner. Hell, he didn't even know they had such an issue. Based on this line, we can presume that all he surmised was that the Forum wants to use the ship to carry a lot of useful people and knowledge to the moon. Hence it stands to reason that their ship needs to be the finest display of engineering in the realm if it is to achieve that goal without the loss of life through people having to be left behind. And as it so happens, Alphinaud, through the contacts the Scions have made collectively, has access to a crap ton of resources as well as a lot of successful scientists, most obviously the two most renowned engineers from Garlemald, one of whom specializes in airships, the entirety of the ironworks, meteorologists, historians, etc., and not to mention money, like a shit ton of it. Basically a network of people and resources that put the Sharlayan Gleaner system to shame. Hence, it wouldn't really matter what the problem is, or if there even is any. Chances are that, with all the knowledge and resources at his disposal, he would be able to improve the design of the ship in some capacity, thus granting him a better bargaining position. Also, the fact that this was an ad hoc session and the urgency behind the final days meant that they most likely wouldn't have time to properly debate the subject and would have to agree or disagree almost impulsively, which is exactly what ends up happening. And remember, this was all improvised on the spot. Even though it's easy in hindsight to say, oh, that solution was obvious, I think the thought process Alphinaud had here requires some outside-the-box thinking, and requires a great amount of adaptability to be able to determine, okay, what's the best way I can make use of all the tools I have available in this situation. But not only do you need outside-the-box thinking, you also need someone who is very optimistic. By this point, we have come to assume that the Forum, maybe even Sharlayan society as a whole, are basically a lost cause in terms of aiding us in our quest. How many people would simply not bother? I happily admit that I most likely wouldn't. Would most people even have the inclination to make the proposal to hear their plan? Probably not, and I like to think that this ties back to Alphinaud's experience in Ilmore. Back in Ilmore, he went in front of those people not expecting them to listen. Sharlayan is a very similar case here, but now we see that he's a lot more confident. Watch how he walks into the room. That's the stature of someone who owns the place. I like to think that he had thought about his experience in Ilmore and said, well, I was able to turn those people around. I can do the same with Sharlayan. It's also worth mentioning that yes, this is very much a gamble made by Alphinaud. I think it had pretty high chances to work, but it's still nice to acknowledge that there are plenty of things that could have gone wrong. There was no guarantee that the Forum was going to listen, nor that they would have even let Alphinaud make his proposal. There was no guarantee that the Scions, even with their plentiful resources, would have been able to improve the ship drastically enough, nor that improvements made would have been satisfactory enough to the Forum, and a ton of other factors I could mention. But the reason I say it had high odds of working is because of the simple fact that it's Alphinaud freaking Levelier making the proposal. He is the diplomat at this point. It is the way in which he uses his body language and his way of wording that simply exudes confidence, and the dialogue reflects that. Just listen to this.
The second condition, also to be met upon our success, is that we be permitted to propose another use for your ark.
We would be at liberty to refuse this proposal.
Of course. If we cannot prove its merit to the 99 here, who are we to stake on it the lives of all peoples of this star?
Delightful as always, Master Alphinaud. Oh, we couldn't have asked for a finer plan. Allow us to solve this complex engineering problem of which we were entirely unaware until moments ago. What could possibly go wrong? The satire writes itself.
The reason I love this scene is because in Endwalker, all the characters got their moments in the spotlight. We saw all of them do something great, whether that was emotional, amazing, epic, whatever the case may have been. And I'm not even talking about the Ultima Thule sacrifice scenes, I am talking before that. And I absolutely love the fact that Alphinaud's moment in the story is so incredibly fitting to his character. Because what he accomplishes here is really rather huge when you stop to think about it. If he hadn't won over the Forum, they would have never been able to reach out to Hydaelyn, nor would they have even had a spaceship which they could have approached Ultima Thule. But of course, every character contributed immensely to the story. I am simply saying that even though Alphinaud's victory here may appear on surface as not that high stakes because it's not action-packed or whatever, there was a great deal of urgency here, and I say it's Alphinaud's moment because this is something that only he could have done. Out of any character in the whole story, only he had the necessary experience, the diplomatic skills, the ability to quickly think on his feet, the confidence, the wits, and the optimism to see it through. All the while, it doesn't fall into those traps I was describing earlier that some writers fall into when they write smart characters. For example, if he had known the specific issue beforehand and knew how to address it, that would have definitely been bullshit and would have been cheap. But his decision making doesn't rely on any BS knowledge that the player isn't privy to. We could have come to the same conclusion too, it's just that we as the player probably wouldn't think of it, and even if we did, we would dismiss it because we would see the Forum as a bunch of stubborn hard-asses who wouldn't listen anyway. This scene is so brilliantly constructed because it serves perfectly as Alphinaud's shining moment in the story, the diplomat who saves the world with his wits alone, all the while remaining logical from an overarching narrative perspective. It's honestly one of the best scenes in Endwalker and mad underrated if you ask me. But it keeps going. What happens is that Alphinaud's boldness here, as well as his ability to later pull through on his promise, is what finally convinces Fourchenault that both Alphinaud and Analysing have grown immensely strong enough through their experiences and slowly makes him reconsider his stance, which then reunites them as he casts aside their ideological differences and accepts them as family once again. See, what I love about this is that it's not the fact that the twins saved the day on Magna Glacies by fighting the monsters, or even the fact that they rallied almost the entire world to their cause. It would have been easy for the writers to just go, okay, Let's show Alphinaud save Fourchenault by fighting and thus show him that you sometimes gotta fight for what you love even if you hate pointless violence, or hey, we put everyone over here to help us out, so your policy of non-intervention is wrong, and now Fourchenault makes a 180. Because doing that would have been lazy and would have been complete BS, because it would spit in the face of all that Fourchenault's character stood for. In other words, you would have ruined a character for the sake of enhancing another, thus making the personal victory of said character feel hollow. What I like is that they instead took the harder route and constructed this very carefully laid out sequence where Alphinaud proves himself to his father, not through action or violence, but through his own wisdom. Now, you could definitely say that Alphinaud shouldn't have gone through such lengths, and I agree, it's a bit absurd that he had to perform such an incredible feat just to mend his relationship to his father, but at the same time, I feel like that adds to Alphinaud's victory here. Because this was a conflict that had been running in the family for a very long time, and very nearly tore the entire family apart. That is precisely why I spent so much time in this video emphasizing this family crisis, so that you, the viewer, fully understand the context and the importance of Alphinaud's achievement here. He single-handedly fixed a family feud that had been plaguing them across 3 generations for God knows how long. And the scene where Fourchenault finally comes around and has a heart-to-heart talk with his children is a very touching scene for this very reason. Also, you know, it's a nice callback to Coils. It's an incredible payoff, especially to those who really paid attention to the backstory behind the Leveler family and understood the significance of it. Before you say it, yes, I know it wasn't just Alphinaud. Amelians, Analysing, even Estinian with this little remark helped achieve this. But I feel like out of anyone, this is definitely Alphinaud's victory, and I think it's the perfect conclusion to his character arc. Not only did he redeem himself after Heavensward, which made him someone who would be proud to call himself Luisua's grandson, but now he can also say the same thing about being Fourchenault's son, and he accomplished both in a way that is true to what Alphinaud is as a person. Between this, the Garlemald segment, further exploration of his backstory, and all the countless emotional moments involving him throughout the story, some of which I will touch on in the Analysing video, I couldn't have asked for a better character arc for Alphinaud in Endwalker. It is grade A writing and something I will always cherish. Let's finally talk what I meant at the start in regards to how he would be the protagonist if not for the Warrior of Light. Defining a Deuteragonist is difficult, but the reason I see him as one from a writer's perspective is because he was the one that was present for the vast majority of the protagonist's biggest struggles and achievements. He was there at the very start of your journey. He was there when you brought closure to the 7th Umbral Era. He was there when you fled to Ishgard. He was there when you ended the Dragon Song War. He was there when you liberated Alamigo, and for when you defeated Tsukuyomi, and so on. Basically, most major events that you can think of, chances are that Alphinaud was there to experience it by your side. And of course, he was there for countless other smaller situations as well. The only expansion story where they make an exception to this is with Shadowbringers, where the Deuteragonists are Artbird and Gratia. But besides that sole exception, Alphinaud is the one, in my opinion. I feel like the best way to summarize this is to look at the Endwalker ending. Notice how they chose Alphinaud as the narrator when he wrote that letter. They could have chosen any character, but they ended up going with Alphinaud. It just makes sense. Of course, you might be asking, hold on, doesn't Analysing qualify as well? Depending on interpretation, yes, there can be more than one protagonist, which means there sure as hell can be more than one Deuteragonist. In fact, I just gave an example with Shadowbringers, but if you want a more popular example, you can look at Harry Potter. It's just that this video is about Alphinaud, so I am focusing on him, but I am not dismissing Analysing's role. But let's move on past the question of what makes him a Deuteragonist and go into what makes him a good one. See, FF14 is an interesting case, seeing as it has a blank slate avatar character as the protagonist. This has many implications, but one of them is that it makes it so that the secondary protagonist, as it were, is all the more important in order for the story to work. For example, due to the nature of the warrior flight being a blank slate, they can't quite be a leader of the party even though they are the protagonist. When you look at other games from the series from 4 till 14, you'll notice that in almost every single instance the protagonist is also the leader of the group. Cecil, Bartz, Cloud, Squall, Zidane, Lightning. The only exceptions to this are FF6, which has an ensemble cast, 12, where they decided to shoehorn a new main character in fat quotations last minute because they didn't think an older, mature protagonist was appealing enough, and 10, where even though Tidus is the protagonist, the story is about Yuna's journey and her being the driving force behind most things, which provides another example of a Deuteragonist, that being Yuna in this case. But these three are basically the exceptions. My point is that for the most part, what you see is that the protagonist is also the one in charge. In FF14 then, it's pretty much Alphinaud who fills this role. At the very start, yes, it is Minfilia who is the leader of the Scions, but even as early as that, Alphinaud was running the show quite a bit in the background, and after the events of 2.5, Alphinaud definitively takes over, and at the start of 4.0, it's pretty much made official that he's the leading figure of the Scions now. Because, yeah, you can't really have an avatar like the warrior flight making decisions, you need someone else in that position. It wouldn't necessarily have to be the Deuteragonist, but I think it makes sense, so that's why you see Alphinaud in that position. It's also worth mentioning that you don't necessarily have to make the protagonist the one in charge and the Deuteragonist the second in command, even if that's pretty common. So even if FF14 didn't have to deal with having a blank slate main character, it could still have easily went for this idea. To follow up on this, Alphinaud's background and character traits allow for exposition via instructive explanations. It's a bit subtle, but what you often see in the FF14 story is Alphinaud making observations and comments on any given situation, kinda stating things in place of the player. The easiest way I could put it is, if you picture that the warrior flight acts as the eyes and ears of the player, then Alphinaud is the brain. Another thing that Alphinaud accomplishes as the Deuteragonist is that, especially at the start of the story, he acts as a contrast to the warrior of light, and he actually highlights the good traits of the warrior of light through his own shortcomings, which is a mark of a good Deuteragonist in my opinion. I refer to the whole thing of him treating people below him as simple tools he could use, or how he lacks courage and keeps sending out the warrior of light to fight his fights for him. Having a character like Alphinaud accompanying us then emphasizes the bravery of the protagonist, the warrior of light. He also works in this role wonderfully because he's a child, and thus we see him grow immensely throughout the story, and this also explains to us why the developers put so much effort into Alphinaud's development. Because they wanted to have us associate him with our own journey. His rich character growth in turn makes us appreciate our own protagonist's journey so much more. Furthermore, he interacts with many of the characters, which is a big part of his character that I haven't mentioned yet. His reliance on other people. Alphinaud needs to be picked up time and time again throughout the story. Essentially, if he was a static member in a raid group, he would be that guy getting carried through all the fights. But this is actually good. Well, not in your static, but in this story. That's another thing that helps make him relatable, because sometimes that's just life. We can't deal with our problems on our own and might need help, and Alphinaud manages to pull through precisely because he had all of these people in his corner helping him out. Cryo, Estinian, Arenvold, Amelians, Alice, Luizua, Usail, Emeric, Orsephon, Lord Edmond, Chai Nu, Dulia Chai, the Warrior of Light, etc., etc. If it was solely this, then that would naturally make him pretty lame, right? If he was just a helpless kid getting carried by other stronger characters. But the thing is that, as much help as Alphinaud receives from others, he very much returns the favor. He influences so many characters in this story, it's actually crazy. In fact, most of the characters I listed here probably relied more on him than he ever did on them in the end. So yeah, it's an awesome part of his character. But I'm also bringing it up here because him interacting with so many of both the major and minor characters in this story helps sell the point that he is the second most important character of the story. Finally, I'd like to add that after those undesirable traits had been weeded out from Alphinaud, what you have is a character who is smart, has his way with diplomacy, is able to formulate decent battle plans, is a capable healer, all the while being really grounded and down to earth because he's still actively growing as a character, while also being somewhat of a goofball at times to remind us that he is still 16. So yeah, a character that the writers would naturally want to keep around for most of the hardships the player will face, and I do think that having him always be there for those moments is what further sold him as an amazing character. It's been a long video, so I feel like it's nice to sum it all up at the end. In summation, I consider Alphinaud my favorite character from the Heidelin/Zodiac story arc in FF14 because his backstory is explored extensively. He's a witty character written well. He develops an insane amount throughout the story. He is relatable. He has a plethora of interesting and colorful character traits that are explored throughout his character's journey, and he makes for an amazing Deuteragonist to have alongside us as we go through our journey, and by extension, his journey. I will also add that I like the core message behind Alphinaud's character. He isn't a character who has a dark side to him. He isn't a grey character. He isn't edgy or a cunt or an asshole. He's someone who is optimistic, someone who has a lot of compassion, someone who believes the best in people and genuinely believes that most people are capable of doing good things if given the chance. He is, as Estinian puts it, idealistic to a fault. That is both his character's biggest weakness as well as his biggest strength. Over in the real world, it's hard to be someone like Alphinaud because you make yourself vulnerable to being used by others, and so many of us don't look at the world like he does. But that is precisely why I appreciate Alphinaud and that message of positivity. If only we had more people like Alphinaud in this world, then perhaps the world wouldn't be such a shithole.